Power is the capacity to change, right? It's the capacity to affect change. If I have power, I can make things happen. I can change things. Okay. But as such, power is morally neutral. It can be used to affect good things. It can be used to affect bad things. Power in itself, in other words, is not our focus. The focus ought to be on the virtue or vice which animate power. The Power of the Dog is one of the most talked about and certainly decorated films of the year. It's received 12 Academy Award nominations, including for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, and many others. As I record these words, we're prior to the ceremony, so I don't know how many it's going to win, but it's certainly gotten a lot of attention, positive attention from the critics. It's a beautiful film to look at. It's a tautly told kind of psychological drama. The acting, indeed, is uniformly outstanding. But what I want to focus on is perhaps the major theme of the movie, which is the play of power, how powerful people relate to each other. And that's what a lot of the critics, indeed, have talked about. The film is set in the 1920s in Montana, in ranch country. And we focus on two brothers, Phil and George Burbank, who are wealthy ranchers. And the film opens, they're on a cattle drive, and they've met this woman named Rose who runs a boarding house. Well, George is smitten by Rose, and they date, and then they marry, and he brings her back to live in the sort of rambling ranch house where the brothers had lived. And she brings with him a son from a previous marriage called Peter. And Peter is a sort of exaggeratedly effeminate young man. Now, we focus next really on Phil, on one of these Burbank brothers. Phil, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, beautifully played, I would say. We hear is a classically trained figure. He's actually a quite brilliant, cultivated man. But when we see him in this movie, he is just a tough cowboy and a man of the earth, a man of few words, difficult to deal with, barking orders at people. And he positively detests Rose and Peter, these two new people that have come into his life. And he basically persecutes Rose. He's someone who knows how to play on people's psychological weaknesses, and he finds that point and then hits on it over and over again. In fact, he's so cruel to her that he drives her to drink and in time really become basically an alcoholic, unable to function. But his his ire is focused on her son, on Peter, this effeminate young man. And you can guess, in that very rough and tumble world of ranchers in the 1920s, they mercilessly go after him. And they're led by Phil, who just keeps attacking and needling and verbally abusing this young man. So what we see, and many critics point this out, it's kind of a pure picture of what we call today toxic masculinity. But here's where the movie, I think, gets really interesting. We discover that though our sympathies are lying with Peter, this very put-upon young man, we discover he's no shrinking violet, that in fact he himself is a very canny figure who, even more than Phil, is able to sense people's psychological weaknesses and to take advantage of them. So without giving away too much of the story, he discovers that Phil has some rather deeply repressed sexual desires, and the young man begins to play upon those and to exploit them, to seduce him and to manipulate him. And by the end of the movie, spoiler alert, I guess I have to say, by the end of the movie, effectively destroys him. As that episode comes to a close, we see him reading from the scriptures, and here's where that enigmatic title of the film comes from. It's from the old King James version of Psalm 22, and here's the line: "Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog." So I think what we're meant to see is he's saying, all right, this dog who's been persecuting my mother to the point of driving her to alcoholism, persecuting me ruthlessly, I found a way to be delivered from the power of this dog. And I think there's a certain, rush of satisfaction. You say, okay, the tables were turned. This toxic masculinity was sort of undermined. See, here's where I began to think about this movie, though, in a more critical vein. The Who has this great song, Won't Get Fooled Again, that contains the line, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, because that's how it often goes in the political order, the cultural order, that the oppressive leader or the oppressive figure is overthrown, but then we find, but the new boss is the same as the old guy. In fact, is as bad as the old guy. What struck me was you do indeed have this display of call it classical, toxic, tough guy masculinity, abusive and all that. But it's met by, I might say, a more indirect, more insinuating, but no less toxic version of masculinity. It's one powerful person coming up against another powerful person, and that second one overcoming the first one. Now, again, I get it. In our culture, think of the revenge fantasy movie. Almost all of Tarantino's movies are revenge fantasy. There's something satisfying about that. But if one form of toxicity is replaced simply by another form of toxicity, have we made any progress? Now, I've talked a lot about the baleful influence of Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, his disciple in the 20th century. Nietzsche, who famously said, we're beyond good and evil. There is no objective good or bad. There's simply the play of powerful wills. In fact, he calls strong people to express their will to power. And so the result is not a world structured by objective moral goods, but rather a world that's made up of the play of powerful wills clashing one against the other. Michel Foucault, of course, in our century, or last century, a disciple of Nietzsche, say the same thing about the objectivity of moral values, that it doesn't exist. And so he's fascinated by the way powerful and powerless relate, the virtue, if you want, in the powerless overturning the powerful, etc. But see, in the classical tradition, so go before people like Friedrich Nietzsche, go back to someone like my hero, Thomas Aquinas, go back to Aristotle. They would have recognized power, of course. Thomas talks a lot about power. Power is the capacity to change, right? It's the capacity to affect change. If I have power, I can make things happen. I can change things. Okay. But as such, power is morally neutral. It can be used to affect good things. It can be used to affect bad things. Power in itself, in other words, is not our focus. The focus ought to be on the virtue or vice which animate power. So is my capacity to change things affected by virtue, by virtuous desire? Or is it informed by a vicious desire? It's not just, hey, isn't that great? That powerful guy was overthrown by that powerful guy. No, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. He's toxic, but that guy's toxic too. Well, then how have we made any progress? What matters is there a virtuous desire that is behind the exercise of power? That's what would have interested Thomas Aquinas, even though Nietzsche and company are much more fascinated, as we are today in our culture, by simply this play of the powerful and the powerless. And let me close by going back to that quote from Psalm 22. The version I gave you, by the way, where the title comes from, is from the old King James. Most of the contemporary versions don't have it quite that way. But that citation is from Psalm 22. It is indeed about God's deliverance of someone from the power of the dog, from a powerful and wicked person. But how fascinating that. It's that psalm that is on the lips of Jesus on the cross as he dies. That cross is all about the deliverance of the human race from powers, from wicked powers. But Jesus is not exemplifying on the cross one more toxic type of power against another toxic form of power. Rather, it's all about the way the divine mercy and compassion and forgiveness swallow up the power of the dog. It's the virtue on display on the cross that matters, not the power. I'm just wondering, as I watch this movie that's very typical of our time, it comes out of the preoccupation of our time. We ought to shift away from simply toxic power met by toxic power and focus rather on the virtue, the love, the compassion, the nonviolence that ought to inform our use of power. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.